Peter, a minute ago there was feedback. I think maybe it's a little better now. Well, folks, I don't know if you can hear my voice, but I'm not feeling well today. I have a cold. For the last, probably 3 days or so, I've had the worst cold I've had in quite a while, and that's okay. I've been healthy throughout the fall and winter, so I've done well. But I've thought about it, and I probably am not going to shake hands at the back door after the service, probably because you don't want to shake my hand. And but I'll tell you what, instead I will go to the reception desk area for a few minutes after the service, and if anyone would like to come and have a word about anything, I'll make myself available. But if I'm not at the door shaking everyone's hand, you'll understand why. Some of you will have noticed that down south, the Americans are in the early stages of their very, very, very long presidential campaign, and they're in the midst of having the registered voters and members of their two parties try to decide who will be the two candidates for president, Republican and Democrat, and they're going around state by state and deciding who the candidates will be. And just this past week, the candidates were campaigning in Iowa. Now, one of the things that I always notice about American politics and American campaigns, which is quite different from what we have in Canada, is that down south, the candidates' religion is often on full display. Candidates are asked very pointed questions about their beliefs and their theological perspectives, and many of the candidates will wear their religious faith very openly on their sleeve. And this past week in Iowa, the winner of the Republican caucus was somebody called Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas. And I watched just a few minutes of CNN's coverage on the election night, and something I noticed, which again was quite different from something you would see here. Ted Cruz got up and he began his victory speech by saying, "To God be the glory. To God be the glory." Now, on the one hand, I have a great respect for somebody who is willing to express their faith so openly, even when they realize it is likely to cause ridicule and mocking from some circles. On the other hand, one can't help but be a little bit suspicious whenever somebody expresses their faith so openly in a political setting, because one wonders, does the politician simply think that expression of faith will be a political winner? And so it seems to be a bit of a double-edged sword. This week, as Lisa mentioned when she was with the children, we are looking at the story of Esther. Esther is a story that took place when many of the Jews were living in exile in the Persian Empire. The Jews living in Palestine were overrun in the year 587 BC by the Babylonians, and as was often antiquity, the Babylonians took many of the leaders and influential people of the conquered nation into exile to make it that much more difficult for those people to, at a future time, plot some kind of rebellion or uprising or something like that. And a time after that, the Persians then defeated the Babylonians, and the Persians controlled that empire, and so many of those Jews who were first taken into exile under the Babylonians were then living in exile under the Persians. And what we find in the book of Esther, like many of the other stories in the Old Testament which describe the time when the Jews were living in exile, is a wrestling with the whole idea of how one can live faithfully and obediently to God in the setting of a foreign and even a hostile nation. You see, at the very beginning of the tradition of ancient Israel, the calling of God and the law of God was directed to the formation of a holy nation, a holy society. And people were given the orientation that living faithfully to God involves living in a setting where everyone is trying to do the same thing, and everyone is trying to follow the same laws, and there was a very national, cultural kind of orientation to the faith of ancient Israel. But in exile, the situation was so different that the people could just not express their faith in the same kinds of ways. And so in Esther, like in many other places in the Old Testament, we find that the Jews wrestling with how to live out their faith in a very different kind of setting than which had first given rise to their faith. Well, we Christians living in 21st century Canada find ourselves in a similar situation in that we are a religious or a spiritual minority, and we are not necessarily used to that depending on the generation we're a part of, and so we too are having to find ways to adjust and find ways to live out and express our faith in a culture which at times is hostile. Now, there's one particular aspect of living out one's faith in a strange or foreign culture which finds its particular focus in the book of Esther, and that is the question of how and when is it appropriate to express one's faith. The story of the book of Esther begins with the Persian Emperor Xerxes throwing a great big party. This is a multi-day bash with all of his friends and all of his hangers-on and lots of wine and people letting the good times roll. You might think of in modern times some kind of Hollywood after party. This is just an over-the-top binge. And at one point in the party, King Xerxes wanted to show off his beautiful wife Vashti, and so he had his servants go and fetch her so that she could come out and parade before all of the king's guests. But Vashti refused to come. She would not be, paraded in front of the others, and the king was so angry that he got rid of her. He sent her away. And then the search was on then for a new queen, and so Xerxes sent his servants, perhaps even some of his soldiers, all around to see if they could round up some more beautiful women for him, and many more beautiful women from around the empire were come and taken into his harem, and one of those was a young Jewish girl named Esther, who later on was made queen because out of all of the women in his harem, she was his favorite. Now, we don't necessarily want to find ourselves in the position of judging people in the past according to our own values, but the situation described at the beginning of the book of Esther and the behavior of King Xerxes and his friends is repugnant. And it is a reminder to us as God's people that we cannot necessarily count on the encouragement of our culture in helping us live faithfully and obediently to God. my cold is infecting my brain, and I am having a hard time concentrating. I'm sorry. The Jews that were living under the Persian exile could not count on Xerxes or the leadership of their nation to provide support or encouragement to the way of life they had been called to do. And so they had to adopt strategies for living faithfully in such a hostile setting. This is what we find people in minority communities doing still to this day, isn't it? A couple of weeks ago, we were invited over to a family's house for dinner, and the family was Jewish, and they invited us to their Shabbat supper. We went over on Friday night and arrived just before the Sabbath began at sundown, and this family lived in North Toronto, and as we were driving to their house, we noticed that there were folks from all over their neighborhood who were walking to one synagogue service or another. And it was immediately evident that we were visiting a family who lived in a very Jewish neighborhood. Most, if not all of the folks who lived there were Jewish. And it is evident that that is a strategy that has been adopted for living in a culture which does not share their beliefs, culture, and lifestyle. And so that's a deliberate strategy of how to try and live faithfully by gathering together. We can see other groups of people adopting such similar strategies. Religious schools is another example of a deliberate strategy to try and live faithfully to God in the midst of a culture which does not believe. And so I don't know what strategies we ought to adopt, but we ought to think of strategies that we take to try and live faithfully. Now, there's an important character in the book of Esther named Mordecai, and he was an official in the government of Xerxes, and Mordecai was a Jew. And Mordecai kept his faith secret. Even though he was an official in Xerxes' government, even though he was an important one, he did not feel it was safe or prudent to make his faith known. Now, Mordecai happened to be the older cousin of Esther. Esther's parents had died when she was young, and Mordecai raised her as his own. And as she was growing up, Mordecai encouraged her to keep her faith and her background secret. Even when Esther was taken to the palace to live with the king, and even when she became queen, Mordecai encouraged her to keep her faith secret. And this is a reminder to us that sometimes it is wise and prudent to keep our faith to ourselves. Some 2 or 3 years ago, you may remember a story in the news about how some Christian missionaries from British Columbia were arrested and thrown in jail in North Korea because their missionary activities are illegal in that country. And it was thought that they were found out and therefore arrested because their church in British Columbia had made a video about them and put it on the internet. Just around this time, there was a missionary organization called Serving in Mission, which brought a couple of missionaries to have dinner with members of the Collier Mission Committee. at the church. And over dinner, they were remarking about this situation. And they said, if God calls us to be persecuted, then so be it. But we don't want to be persecuted because we were careless or foolish. And so therefore, they have to be prudent in the way that they carry out their activities and in the way that they express their faith in a hostile situation. Sometimes, in different kinds of situations, it is best to keep our faith to ourselves. Sometimes we need to do it for our own safety, and sometimes we need to do it out of courtesy for an environment in which we find ourselves. Now, something quite terrible happened in the book of Esther. While Esther was queen, there was an official named Haman, and he was at the very top of the civil service, and the culture of the time meant that he was due a great deal of respect, and he loved to parade around and have people even bow down and show their servitude to him. Well, one of the people who worked for him was Mordecai. And Mordecai refused to bow down before Haman. And Mordecai said, "We are Jews." Interestingly, he expressed it. "And we do not bow down before anyone except for God." Now, Haman was obviously very insecure, and he was incensed, and he went straight to King Xerxes, and he said, "Do you know, King, there are these people living in our land called the Jews, and they refuse to show us the respect that we are due." And it's not recorded in the book of Esther, but we can well imagine Haman having said to the king, "If they will not even bow down to me and show respect to me and to give me my due, how, O great king, can they possibly be loyal to you? And so we should get rid of them." And King Xerxes, who by the sounds of things didn't spend a lot of his time sober or governing wisely, said, "Sure, I don't know anything about these people, but let's get rid of them." And then Mordecai went to the queen and says, "You must tell the king that you are a Jew." And he gives this beautiful quote, "It may be that you were made queen for just such a time as this." In other words, that God's hand of providence, until then invisible, was then being made clear. And so Esther was very worried about what she would say and how she would approach the king. All her life she had found her religion to be something which was potentially dangerous for her, and she'd been hiding it from the king for all this time, and you can well imagine how nervous she was about the prospect of it. She threw a wonderful dinner for the king, and he asked her, what would you like? "I will give you even half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "O king, please spare my life and those of my people, for I am a Jew." And the king granted her request. And that is a reminder to us that sometimes it is good and wise to express our faith. When I was a university student, I had a couple of summers where I worked at a golf course near our home. I was on the grounds crew. I cut grass and raked bunkers and fixed divot holes on the greens and all kinds of things like that. And at the end of one of my summers, I was going back to school, and of course it was not yet even fall, so all of the other fellows that I worked with were going to carry on, and I was leaving, and we were sort of sitting around at the end of the day on my last day at work, and these guys who were not university student types of guys, they asked me what I was studying and what I wanted to do. And at that time I was actually going to theological college. I was studying theology, and I was training for the Christian ministry. And they were very curious about this. And so they wanted to ask what that involved, and what beliefs did I have, and what were those beliefs of my community. And so quite unexpectedly, I was there giving an account of my faith to these other guys I'd been cutting grass alongside all summer. And I don't know if I converted any of them or even made much of a difference to them, but I tried my best to give as good an account as I could. Now, I have never been in a work setting where I felt the need to evangelize my coworkers, maybe here at the church, but not previously. But sometimes it is the right thing to do to share one's faith. There may be moments when, for whatever reason, the time seems right. There may be opportunities made possible by a close relationship where you know someone in such a way as to make it the right thing to do to share your faith. It may be, as in my case at the golf course, that the invitation comes. And we ought to be ready to respond to that invitation. A couple of weeks ago, in our journey through the biblical story, we looked at the book of Daniel, and some of you may have been here when we looked at Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel took place in a similar kind of way. It was a story about some Jews living in exile in the Persian period. Now, Daniel was someone who had his faith on full display at all times. Even when it was made temporary illegal to pray to anyone except for the Persian king, Daniel continued to pray with his windows open facing east so that he could turn towards Jerusalem, and he didn't care what the consequences were. He was going to let everyone know all the time that he was a Jew and that he was praying to God. Here in the book of Esther, we find a slightly different emphasis. Esther and her family are keeping their faith a secret until it is just the right time. And so it goes to show us that there is no one right answer about how and when we ought to share our faith. There's no one-size-fits-all scenario. There are times when it is wise to keep our faith to ourselves, and there are times when it is wise to be able to share our faith with others. I think whatever situation we find ourselves in, we at least ought to be ready to demonstrate, when called upon, our faith in God with humility and love. Amen.